You're listening to the Animal Heartbeat. My name is Kieran Bourget.
Hi, and I'm Jose Logumatos. This is the world's only podcast dedicated to veterinary cardiology. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Animal Heartbeat, your veterinary cardiology podcast. Today, I always say that we have a very, very special guest, and we do. But today, for the very first time, we have a guest that is not a cardiologist. Well, we have Dr. Chris Orton, which is half cardiologist, half surgeon.
Chris would argue with you that he's a cardiologist.
True. He's half surgeon, half cardiologist. But today, I'm a bit nervous, or I'm very nervous, to be honest. We have with us today Dr. Julie Rosser. Julie is a PhD and a board-certified surgeon, both by the American College and European College. She is the EBVS CEO. So the EBVS stands for the European Board of Veterinary Specialisation. And so a bit a different topic, right, Kieran?
It is different. Julie, welcome.
Thank you.
Strange thing to be talking to two cardiologists on a cardiology podcast, but we became very interested over the recording of season 3, thinking about the cardiology icons, these incredibly experienced veterinary specialists, and it got us thinking about the nature of veterinary specialty. And I think you've got some amazing insights into veterinary specialty, certainly in Europe, and probably some comparative aspects with other parts of the world as well. So we'd love to chat to you some more about that.
Happy to. It's my honor to be here. I'm a little intimidated, honestly, by the gravitas of cardiology. It was a long time ago that Chris Orton was my professor. So yeah, and I'm very much coming from the large animal space. So a little bit different perspective, but I'm excited to get into it.
Julie, thinking about veterinary specialty, what does it mean to you and to EBVS to be a recognized specialist?
So I'm going to focus on the EBVS specialist. Yeah. I'm going to take out the recognized bit for now, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, I'm sure. EBVS certified specialists are primarily around quality assurance, right? So there's a rigorous pathway to get to the name of EBVS certified specialist. And that includes at least 4 years of training after veterinary graduation, usually with pretty high intensity level supervision or mentorship in clinical specialties, of course, directly interfacing with patients and clients. In non-clinical specialties, that looks a little bit different. And then what's also included in that EBVS certified specialist title is recertification. And what that basically means is there's a quality assurance that goes on every 5 years beyond the original successful completion and awarding of the title. And those are primarily run by the colleges themselves, but there is a standard level of what each college has to offer within that quality assurance.
And is that the role of EBVS to set that quality standard amongst different colleges?
It's one of EBVS's roles. I think the scope of EBVS has been expanding in recent years, and that is primarily oriented around supporting our specialists as well in the market and in the profession. So yes, one of our roles is to set that standard for quality assurance and make sure that it's maintained, but in ways that are cohesive with the needs of the profession and where the market is going. A good example of this would be the progress that's been made towards animal welfare across multiple species in the last decades, right? And that needs to be a primary consideration in the standards of quality assurance, among other things, right? Advances in education would be another example.
Just for us, can you give us an idea of how many colleges do we have in Europe? How many different specialities do we have in Europe?
Yeah. In Europe, there are 27 specialty colleges,
Okay.
and they make up 39 specialties.
Wow.
Well,
Yeah.
do those colleges follow more or less the same guidelines or rules regarding residency training and to test the specialists or the future specialists? I mean, for example, which exams people need to sit, the credentials that they need to satisfy, the criteria. Are they more or less the same across different colleges, or are there differences?
They're broadly similar. Again, there's a standard set by EBVS that has to be met, but how it's applied can be customized by each college. I think it's the easiest way to exemplify this is, again, to think of the differences between a college that has a lot of clinical facing work and a college that would have
Sure.
maybe little to no clinical facing work. Their needs and the needs of their residents or their trainees might be quite different. So it's important for EBVS to offer the flexibility and a certain amount of autonomy to the colleges in order to execute these. EBVS has no desire in current years to be a police of standards. The standard is set, it's done so in a way that's mindful of trying to accommodate the diversity of college needs. But the implementation and the autonomy of the colleges to act according to what their residents and their institutions can reasonably accomplish and what their specialty precludes remains with those colleges.
How different are is the training paths between the American colleges and European colleges? Are they at the moment very similar, or there are still stark differences?
It depends a little bit on the college specifically. By and large, they're mostly still similar. There are differences in colleges, so it's not a one-to-one mirror. I think the Veterinary Practitioner College or Board, actually, in the US is a good example of that. So there's not completely mirrored specialties here in Europe. In fact, the colleges in some species might even be more formalized. That being said, EBVS has taken a lot of strides towards improving accessibility to residency and to specialization, because we see a little bit of segmentation still in Europe about which countries have access to training programs. And so that flexibility has been designed around that. It is a complex situation. So we could go so far as to say it's multifactorial. And I think that in the United States, the access is probably a little bit more centralized. For example, there's a match program in the US. So at the very, it's easy to find what programs are available.
Yeah, and that's very different, isn't it? We don't have something like that across Europe. You mentioned there about the sort of, I guess, the distribution of training programs across Europe. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think we would all instinctively feel that it's probably quite uneven across different countries. Tell us a little bit about the situation and the needs there, because that's really interesting, because Europe's a small place, really.
You're probably going to have to stop me on this one, because I could talk the whole hour.
We'll set a timer.
Yeah, it's turned into a little bit of a passion project of mine, because I stepped back from surgery several years ago and went into an industry and market space in entrepreneurial and innovation sort of spheres. And so I'm very passionate about knowing what our market status is. Right. And it's the same question, actually, that you just asked. If you start to dissect, even from specialty to specialty, but especially from country to country, the distribution is hugely variable. It's impressive how diverse it is. It's kind of mind-blowing. So traditionally, Western Europe has still more specialists across more specialties. That's important because it makes an inherent barrier to some degree for countries like off the top of my head, Poland, Romania, they have specialists, but just not nearly in the volume as, for example, Belgium or the Netherlands. So the number of training programs that are accessible to people graduating in those countries are reduced significantly. A lot of people train out of country in Europe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they return to their home country and start programs. So then it gets a little bit more there, of course, we can dive into another level of complexity when we talk about the variability of which specialties are highly represented in which country. And this is the stuff that I kind of geek out over. It might be more detail than we need right now. There's a nice kind of data subset, if you will, of 5 countries that all fall within the same percentile of specialists. So if we look at it just numerically, we don't get a lot of insight into how it reflects the local market, right? If we look at it just numerically, the most specialists are in the UK, EBVS specialists.
Right.
If we compare that to the number of veterinarians per country, we end up with a percentile, and it becomes much more, in my opinion, interesting. So in that instance, Switzerland is this huge outlier, having 16.6% of Swiss veterinarians as EBVS registered specialists.
Wow.
Outlier. Yeah.
Now, Jason, you did your residency in Switzerland, didn't you? Did you have a feel for that?
No, not at all. Not at all. Interesting. If you would ask me to guess a number, I would think there are not many specialists there. That's interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
Well, that's compared to the number of veterinarians.
Right.
Yeah, totally. Still, yeah. Are there figures that you would say that you want to achieve? You say, how many specialists do we need in proportion to general practitioners? Are there figures to say, okay, this is the target that EBVS will have. We want this amount of specialists per amount of veterinarians in the country.
So that's exactly what I'm hoping to establish with this kind of market data. So what I have hypothesized, and we don't yet have enough data and haven't put it through a lot of methodology yet to see whether or not this hypothesis is provable. But my goal is, if we can identify the range of quote unquote healthy market saturation in variable countries, then we can have an idea of what a recommended number of specialists is.
Yeah.
Ideally for each specialty. So the ranges are quite broad. And the way that we've pulled the data together includes looking at the number of species that specialty would treat in each country, which is kind of fascinating in and of itself. So going back to that sort of data set of 5 countries that all fall in a similar range, they all fall somewhere along the lines of the 4th percentile. So they all have approximately 4% of EBVS recognized specialists as compared to the total population of veterinarians in that country. So that includes the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland, and Austria. And I've lived in Austria for 12 years, and I did not expect Austria to be on that list.
And also Ireland, it surprises me a little bit.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Even just that is fascinating.
Interesting. And so how's the situation in the UK? Do we have too many or too few specialists overall?
I would say in the UK, it depends on the specialty. So the UK is not the highest after Switzerland. It's 4.6, I think, %. And I believe it's the Netherlands that is higher at 4.9%. But there again, you can see large differences from specialty to specialty. So the UK quite often does have the highest percentage of specialists in a specific specialty, like behavioral medicine, for example. In other places, it's not so straightforward.
Is there a strategy? Let's say you would say, okay, the number we are aiming for is, 10% specialists in each country. And then if we start reaching 12%, 15%, 20%, would that raise a red flag saying, whoa, there are maybe too many specialists in this country at the moment. Would that raise a red flag, and what the strategy would be? Who would be the responsible to say, well, maybe we cannot have so many residency programs in this country, or we need to limit the amount of specialists we are training for the next X amount of years? I know this will be incredibly complex and difficult to do, but I guess my question is, would this be raised by the college, or would this be raised by EBVS? And do we ever will know that, okay, we are reaching a red flag?
Yeah, so there are colleges that are asking this question for themselves. And I want to go back again to just the variability from country to country market. So another example of this would be Spain in 2023 was the market lead of production in fish, pork, and also poultry. So the number of veterinarians that they might need, or the number of specialists that they might need in those specialties, might be higher than another country.
Right.
So to make a blanket statement and say, above 10% is probably never going to be accurate to a level of granularity for individual colleges. And then I want to go back to what may be a provocative point. And it's sort of two-pronged. One, when we look at EBVS registered specialists, we're talking about 40% academia and roughly 34% private practice.
Interesting.
Right? Just because we can piggyback on the academia topic, I think across Europe and probably also in the United States, it's been a long time since I've lived there, but I would be bold enough to assert that it's probably similar. When we look at academia, subtracting veterinary medicine and veterinary specialization, the number of positions for people coming out of PhDs in academia is tiny in percentile to the number of PhDs that go through programs. But we rarely, if ever, question the viability of taking in those PhD students. It's just naturally assumed that they're going to have to go out on their way and find a position for themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting that we approach veterinary specialization in that way, but I am suggesting that we become a little bit more mindful, particularly in how we are growing and educating our trainees, of what the market demands might be and what non-traditional pathways might be interesting for them.
There's a few things to talk about there, isn't there? So I always think of a PhD as being your driving license to be a researcher. That's what I think Adrian Boswood said that to me once. It's your driving license to be a researcher. Is a specialty diploma a driving license to work as a specialist? Is it sort of your qualification, your beginning point that you can then go and evolve your career around that and sort of take more ownership of that, I guess. I think as time has gone on, more and more specialists are working in private referral practice across Europe. And of course, alongside that, there has been more corporatization of that private referral practice. And I speak as someone who has worked in corporate referral practice on and off, over the last decade. So when we talk about what happens to residents after they train and after they achieve their diploma, if you're looking at that from the corporate perspective, I imagine there's got to be a consideration of, are we training our own future here for other clinics, maybe a different one to the one the resident trained at, but within the group? So, is there a way of corporate referral practices growing their own and building their own base of specialists? And then, of course, we've got the whole thing about how do they ensure that? Do they ensure that by great working conditions and really bonding people in? You hear about some practices tying people in or trying to tie people in financially. I don't think that's very common in the UK, certainly, but I have heard of it in other countries. What are your thoughts on those aspects and the sort of added dimension of business there?
Well, I'm a huge proponent of business awareness, even I would call it business ideology being introduced.
It's the reality of working now, right? We need to be aware of these things.
To be honest, I think it's even more than the reality of working. So when I joined EBVS staff, which was about 2.5 years ago, I think, I needed stakeholder feedback because I was an EBVS recognized specialist, but I didn't have a lot of internal knowledge around the workings and the position. So I went out and just asked as many people as I could what their pain points were. Because, coming from an entrepreneur space, it's all about what are the unmet needs. And the most common piece of feedback I got, I think I spoke with one-on-one with like 21 of the 27 colleges, as well as a good number of our sister organizations in Europe. Whether we're talking about veterinary specialization or veterinary medicine, the number one piece of feedback was, we do not feel that society at large recognizes our value or our contribution. And if you do not focus on what creates a business case, what value am I bringing, what value am I creating, then the public cannot understand what your contribution is. So I think that this sort of awareness is really essential for people coming into the profession, as you said, with a driver's license to begin their specialist career. I think that was really well said. It's all about ownership, and it's all about recognizing it doesn't matter if you're in academia, if you're going into corporate practice, if you're going into independent practice, or if you're going a non-practical route, which is surprisingly where I ended up, right? What matters is wherever you go, having ownership on the value that you're creating in that space. So I want to make this a more specific example because, we've talked about, are there enough jobs? Well, I interviewed somebody recently for our video project, and he said to me, yeah, I was sitting in my residency realizing that there might not be enough jobs. And so I found something about the specialty that I loved that didn't exist in veterinary medicine yet. And I went out, I trained with human physicians on how to do it, and I've brought it back, and now it's a big success here in Austria. So having that awareness of what is missing, what could be provided, how can I bring value that maybe hasn't been there before? That's absolutely essential when you're coming to a corporate practice or any private practice. You have to keep the lights on. We can talk about the commerciality of medicine, and we tend to retreat or avoid that topic as a profession. But if you don't keep the lights on for your practice, then your patients don't have access to care 3 months down the road. So it is ethical and it is necessary. And part of that is having ownership over the value that you're bringing. Did I answer your question, or did I just create a huge tangent?
I've forgotten what my question was because I was so interested in what you were saying.
Can I just say that I really like what you just said, because I have to be honest, I've been worried about the fact that maybe we have too many specialists. I've been worried about myself training residents and thinking, will they have a job? Am I
That's
training
really
residents?
interesting you say that. Yeah,
just
it's really interesting.
I worry because, again, I'm in academia. And this, I think, is a bit more challenging because we are supposed to train residents. That's, I think, is one of my roles, is to train new specialists. And then worries me that when I look around, are they finding their jobs, and people may be struggling to find jobs and so on. And again, I came from from another country. I was trained, well, in this case in Switzerland, but I never returned to my country. I know that many people would love to return to their country and they don't. But, and there's so many open questions. But what you just said is really cool, because from the very first day I start my vet school in Lisbon, 90% of my professors told me there's not enough jobs. We have too many vets in Portugal. There are too many vet schools. You're going to struggle to find a job.
That must be so demoralizing.
It was like we were all very worried from day one. And they were not trying to be negative. They were a bit negative, but they were just worried that we would not find jobs. And I never thought about that. And we are going through the same route with specialization. And the fact is, I always found, I was always sure, I'm sure we'll find jobs. We're going to need to be creative. We're going to need to find ways to make our job great. And if I cannot be whatever small animal medicine or specialist, I will do something else. And what you say is really cool, Julie, because in fact, it's probably great for our profession that there is this pressure, and for our colleges, because we need to be creative and find other routes and other ways to be good and to do something that we are passionate about. Yeah, that's cool.
But and I'm gonna just counter what you're saying a little bit, just say and just say that probably all of us in the UK feel like there are plenty of specialists, depending on the specialty, right? Yeah. Now, I wouldn't have said that we had a lot of behavior specialists, but you know what? Boy, oh boy, we need more behavior specialists in the UK, despite the fact we're leaders in that field across Europe. How many companion animals do you see with behavioral problems that would benefit from behavioral specialist input? I mean, I see them all the time. Mm-hmm. Thinking about that UK-centric perspective, we all feel like there are plenty of specialists, and we say, oh, maybe there are too many specialists. There's a couple of forces that drive that for me. I think one is competition. All of us see competition around us, right? We work in the south of England. I work in the southwest. You work in the southeast, I guess, mid-east of the UK, amidst plenty of other specialists. I think if you go to the northwest of England, or if you go to Aberdeen, you probably are not feeling like there's lots of specialists around. The other thing is geography in Europe. We've already said we have lots of specialists in the UK, or we feel like we do. Compare that to Romania or Poland or somewhere where there are plenty of animals that need care and veterinary professionals that need support and the option to refer, and yet they don't have access to the same number of specialists as we do. What are your thoughts, Julie? You've been nodding, which is reassuring. But I just think it's very easy to have this UK-centric perspective in a climate where there's lots of competition. We know there have been redundancies made, in the last couple of years. And we maybe know people who've been affected by that. We maybe know people coming out of residencies who've found it hard to get a job, or residents who haven't been replaced because the program's been discontinued, at least temporarily. What's the landscape looking like in the UK, but also across Europe?
There's so many ways we can go with this, right? I want to start with pointing out, whenever we look at a high specialist market, and by that, we classically think of the UK, but as I've mentioned, Switzerland would also absolutely fit that description. I can't say categorically, but we commonly see a lot of concentration of specialists as well. And one of the things that we hear, not infrequently, is that they prefer to stay in a place where they have a lot of specialist support. We're trained quite often in those environments. It is a comfortable environment, but then it sort of predisposes us to the same situation that we're discussing, right? If you want to stay in a facility that has at least 35 specialists, you kind of create a risk factor then. So I think this, in my opinion, this comes back a little bit to ownership of, if I stay in my comfort zone, by staying for my entire career in a place that has a high concentration of specialists, because that's the way I want to practice medicine, then perhaps I have to be cognizant of the fact that there could be risk factors in the long term for job security. Versus, if you're willing to go out and establish a specialist service, maybe in a different country that has a demand, but without the number of specialists in supportive roles or surrounding you, then you probably have really high job security, although it may be quite a bit more difficult to establish yourself as a trusted service. And that's what we see in some of these countries that don't have as many specialists. So I think there are trade-offs, and I think it's about, stepping back, maybe even to the level of sort of the helicopter view, and making decisions that are informed based on what risks you're willing to accept.
I was talking to somebody today who is looking at residencies and in cardiology, and it's a passion for her. You can see how driven she is. She's very dedicated. She's taken a big pay cut and a big change to do a rotating internship in order to lay the foundation for residency training. And she's applying for residency. She's visiting people who have residencies at the moment, and she's looking at that. It's so passionate at that stage of the game. And I think day to day, we all feel the passion of the work we're doing. But as you say, you've got to be quite analytical to think ahead like that and plan ahead. So I don't know if people who are applying for residencies can see that perspective. I think it's different when you're so driven to follow your dream and do what you want to do. And, obviously all the rational people are dreaming of sitting in a dark room scanning dogs and cats all day. Maybe, a little bit of CT angiography or something. But I think it's so hard at that stage to think 10 years down the line and think, what's the landscape going to look like? And do I want to move back to the country I come from? Do I want to, go out on my own? And that feels very scary, I think, for many people who've done residency training programs.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think one of the reasons that remains daunting or even intimidating is because we don't impart, whether it's in specialist training or in veterinary medical education, we don't impart a lot of or very much at all entrepreneurial or business orientation. So it is quite daunting to look at it. It's a whole nother skill set. And I think that I'm not suggesting that we try to embed that in specialization training. I do think looking for ways to make it accessible is warranted, not while reinventing the wheel. It doesn't need to come specifically from us. I think there are a lot of resources out there. And I would agree with you. Probably most people looking at residency aren't really on a 10-year path, right? Mentally speaking.
No.
And that's fine. I think there's nothing wrong with that. I do think that we as supervisors and people driving the future of specialization do need to be aware of that. And we need to be able to support them as they progress along sort of the maturation or emotional journey that is in parallel with a residency, in order that they are prepared. And I don't want to be discouraging or disheartening to anybody. Like you said, Jose, with your institution in Lisbon, I do think offering them some level of realistic expectations in a hopefully non-discouraging or non-pessimistic way is fair.
This is so interesting. Again, there are so many different ways to look into it, and it's great to hear your views and so on. Regarding from someone again that came from another country and to be trained, because there were no residencies in Portugal when I finished my vet school there, and this might be a generational thing, but we all wanted to go back. Our dream was we go abroad, no matter where, we become specialists, and I will go back, I will come back to Lisbon. That was very clear in my head, and that was the plan. And if I talk to colleagues of mine that did residencies in different countries, some of my very best friends did residencies in different areas, specialities, and in different countries, and the aim was really to go back. And we knew that from the beginning. So we had that vision that in 10 years, I want to come back. And it 90% never happened. And I think that the reasons are different from person to person. I certainly have my own reasons. And at least some of my friends and colleagues I see that then try to come back, the main reason is their concern is their income, the safety of their job, because they again they are people that came abroad speaking countries where they were of course not native speakers, and they like challenges. They would love to go back and just build something from scratch. I don't think they are scared about that.
You can't be risk averse, can you?
Exactly. So you want that. It's just, I think then you are at the age that you may start having a family, and then if you want to go back, what your income will be. You don't need to be income driven, but you need to understand, okay, how much am I going to make when I go back? And so I, at least from my perspective, the colleagues I see is more. And people that have tried to go back and then has failed was because they didn't find the job security or the income that would allow us to have a certain type of life that they would like to, which I think it makes really challenging because those countries need specialists. I think many specialists are willing to go there, but they maybe don't find the right conditions, which is really challenging.
And obviously, the conversation we're having now, we can apply not just to Europe, right? Let's think globally. Let's think about, all of our amazing colleagues who work in South America and who work in Asia and who are doing these amazing things. For me, one of the biggest privileges of being a veterinary specialist is traveling and speaking and meeting people and talking to them about the work they do. And it has been eye-opening. The level of quality in cardiology and excellence in Brazil, the amazing stuff that people are doing in Southeast Asia, in terms of advanced procedures, access to advanced technology, it's really opened my eyes. But many of these colleagues can't get specialist status because they don't have access to the training without uprooting their whole family and moving from a country where economically it just may not be viable to moving to a more expensive country where the cost of living is different, the currency is much stronger, whatever. There are many, many factors. So my question is, how do we deal with that? What strategies are there that we can think of?
There's a few strategies that are implemented on a college by college basis. So one of those is the international specialist registration, and that's primarily targeted at countries that would not otherwise have access to specialization. So that's basically, if you can demonstrate that you fulfill these criteria, then the college can choose to send you to the exam. So that's one pathway, as we call it. It's quite specific. Not all colleges offer it. And the criteria, again, there's a broad standard set by EBVS, and then the implementation is left to the college on an individual basis. The same is true for this flexible or modular pathway. So this is relatively new. We have had a lot of colleges. I think a lot of specialists are already aware of the idea of alternative pathway. Certainly, my American sports med was an alternative pathway residency. So it's we've all kind of been familiarized with that idea. And the flexible pathway is another option. It is not a must. Colleges are not required to offer it. But the idea behind it is exactly as you say. Perhaps there's a socioeconomic barrier. Perhaps there's other barriers to completing a residency, like being a single parent or not having any kind of funding for your residency and therefore being part-time or even less than part-time in doing your qualifications. So the flexible pathway is built around this, and it's essentially designed on an ECTS system. And it's meant to be done where portions of this can be modularized in smaller time packets, or even in micro-credentials, which are being highly promoted by the European Union or the European Commission. The uptake of that pathway is kind of a slow ball that's starting to roll, if I can say it like that. It's starting to grow some momentum, but it is a hard pathway because you don't have direct supervision. So it is the ultimate of residency ownership. And it wasn't designed to, create that level of ownership. That's a byproduct of making it accessible in this way.
I think you've got to be quite a badass, forgive the terminology, to own your training in such a way. I think it takes so much cognitive energy, so much self-organization and sacrifice to do that. What's getting in the way of that being more widespread?
Well, it requires a redesign for a lot of the colleges, particularly when we talk about this micro-credential or modular content on things like research principles and, how one of the big ones, and I'll speak openly because it is my college, how do you teach somebody surgery without direct supervision? And I think that's a justified question. And there's a version of that question for pretty much every specialty,
Yeah.
I don't want to be too much of a surgeon and isolationist. Every college has valid concerns there. And yet, with technology being what it is and advancing at the rate that it is, there are, in a lot of instances, potential solutions to find that. Now, they may have to be creative. You may have to find a way to take 4 weeks off and go train with a board certified surgeon.
Yeah.
Over various points throughout that pathway, but it could be done if you wanted to, and if you were committed to doing that. So I agree with you. I think it is badass, and it's kind of funny because at the time of initial presentation and conception, a lot of the colleges felt that it could lower the quality standard.
That was certainly a concern when it was raised across ECVIM. And I remember I was on the modular residencies committee of ECVIM. I was the cardiology person. And I went into that thinking, I'm not sure this is going to work. But after we talked it out and we'd really sort of thrashed out the idea, I thought, yeah, this could work, actually. This was great. It fell flat, as you will know, I'm sure, at one of our AGM meetings. And it was clear at the AGM that the majority of the body of the college diplomats were strongly against it. And their main concern was quality control. For the cardiologists, the question that was always asked to me was, what about interventional training? How do we do that on a remote basis? Is it possible? So I think these concerns are very real, and I'm sure that ECVIM is not alone amongst the European colleges.
They're definitely not. And I certainly think that a lot of those questions are incredibly valid. They're totally valid. And we may not have solutions to all of those on a technological level or even a logistical level, right? So this is one of the reasons that the flexible pathway is not a requirement for colleges. It is an option. It is encouraged. For the other reasons that we discussed, geographical accessibility, socioeconomic accessibility, so on and so forth. But I think, one of the barriers has also been we've all come to realize how difficult this pathway is on an individual level to implement. And so that has also become a barrier. And, a lot of the colleges, I would say the majority of the clinical colleges already have highly implemented, quite popular alternative pathways that basically fulfill most of the needs as far as bringing in additional residents. And no one is mandating that we switch from alternative to flexible, right? I think one piece of the discussion that maybe hasn't matured to a head-on version, or if I can say even nail on the head, is the idea of fear of competition. So this is a little bit, I don't want to confuse this with, a high saturation or a high concentration of specialists. What I want to kind of call out a little bit, although I realize it is dancing on a line potentially, we hear this sort of fear of not having enough cases, and it's not exclusive to specialists. It also is something that we see affecting relationships with referring or primary care veterinarians. And I think that I have a giant table with all of the numbers of all of the species in every country in the European Economic Area. All of them are coming from Eurostat and OECD. I think that we're a little bit too focused on the fear of not having enough cases. Now, I'm not saying that's not a legitimate thing. We all see caseloads come and go, right?
Yeah.
But particularly, we're very lucky, I think, as specialists, because we can adjust what our service offer is. If I'm not seeing, in my residency, we saw a strong downtick of colic surgeries. Strong. Like, most of my abdomens ended up being bovine.
That's really interesting, crikey.
Yeah. I mean, I did my training in the States during the housing bubble, and horses in the United States are essentially disposable income. Part of the reason I ended up in Europe, to be honest. Then you have to look at what other services could be available. Could I consult? Is there somebody, hospitals upgrading their facilities, and I could consult in what they might need if they want to bring a surgeon on in the future? This is a loose example, but, anesthesia. Can I consult for a local hospital who, they're not going to employ an anesthesiologist for every spay? So maybe I could go there, get a healthy consultation fee to bring up their existing protocols to, a gold standard when they haven't been revisited for 5 years or 10 years. What other options are there? What services are we well positioned to offer as specialists that we're not offering? Because if I base my fear of caseloads on the number of colics that I'm cutting year on year, there's not going to be control of that.
Yeah, I think that's very real. I think that's very real. I think it's. Do you agree, Jose? I mean, I think a lot of us, we talk to each other and go, "Oh, how many PDAs are you doing? Is it less than last year?" And I certainly have these conversations with people.
No, totally. As you were saying, that's why people then are worried about the competition. And that's why we think there are too many. We think there are potentially too many cardiologists, because we feel like we are not seeing that many intervention procedures anymore, potentially. And I think that's. But you are right, Julie. The cases wax and wane, but I think in the trenches, when you are working, you feel like, well, we are seeing less cases. There are probably more specialists than we need. But I love the idea that we need to be creative. For example, I can give my own example. When I started a service in Cambridge, it would be very difficult for me to just focus on interventional cardiology, because it was a service that was starting from scratch, and there are other centers around Cambridge that were doing already a lot of interventional cardiology. So we thought, okay, where's the gap? And then we focused on, for example, on a cardiomyopathy clinic, because there was nothing around like that. And then slowly we build our interventional case log, but we didn't focus on interventional cardiology initially, or it was not our main focus at the start. So I like that. Can I just ask you, because we talk about PhD students before, and we compare PhD students with residency training. And something that happens a lot in different countries is the government will sponsor a PhD, program for that person to go abroad, get their degree, and then there's an agreement to come back to their country and work, I guess, an X amount of years on that country. Could the colleges, could EBVS suggest, make some healthy pressure on countries where there's not many specialists, for the government to try to sponsor, help, facilitate their vets to go abroad, get their training, and then come back?
Yes, this is a hopeful byproduct of this sort of market spreadsheet that I've put together. That's the tip of the iceberg version, right? So there are pieces of information that are missing from that, and that are a big component in national governments subsidizing any kind of specialist training at an EU or EBVS level, is a lot of countries throughout Europe have national specialization programs, which may or may not be tied in with the local academic institutions and or the national veterinary chambers. This creates another level of complexity, because from country to country, those training programs can be variable. And in some instances, those programs might even be variable within a country. A way that I like to exemplify this is comparing Austria and Germany. So they both have national veterinary specialists. In some counties in Germany, they're very similar to the specialties, the titles or the names of specialties in the EBVS colleges. In Austria, a lot of the national specialists are completely different than existing EBVS specialties. So there are neighboring countries that have a lot of parallels or similarities in different systems, including sometimes, but not always, healthcare and veterinary medicine. But in this respect, there are already glaring differences. So that makes it a little bit challenging to recruit the national government and or the National Veterinary Chamber to support specific training at an EBVS level. There's another factor here, which is sometimes there may be revenue flows that accompany that. And we rarely talk actually about the cost of training a resident and who's absorbing that cost. So it sounds like a conversation to avoid, but in reality, it's something that does probably need transparency, not on a national level, but on a level of what is being invested into these individuals to train them, right?
And that's hard. And I think it varies between specialties, doesn't it? How profitable is a resident over 3 years? It's quite different for a cardiologist from a surgeon, I think.
Well, and not only how profitable is the resident, but what is the institution, whether it's academic or corporate or independent private practice, what in-kind costs is that institution contributing to that person's supervision and training?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that before, and this, I think, really an important topic is that different countries will have their own specialities, their own degrees, which is certainly confusing for pet owners, carers, and also confusing among veterinarians, I'm sure. Is there any way to try to make things more even, and that specialists with nationality degrees could have a different path or route to become specialists considered by EBVS? Or is there a way to make this more clear across Europe?
So there is some work being done in this respect, and it has to be done with a lot of intention and mindfulness. There are countries that don't have a lot of specialists who are establishing their national specialist programs, and they have approached EBVS to help them define that in a way that might be consistent with EBVS or might dovetail into people going on to complete EBVS specialization. So there's a lot of complementarity in that approach. And I think there's been a couple of announcements actually in the last maybe 5 months of EBVS newsletters and social media around countries doing this and it being publicly released. Another place that this has been started is Spain. There was a big announcement that EBVS recognized, as well as RCVS and AVMA recognized specialists, were acknowledged at a legal level in Spain. And I think there's now, subsequent works being done in some of these countries, exactly as you say, to try and reduce confusion around these potentially similar sounding titles, but also around which qualification means what, particularly at the level of the consumer, right? But also to look for, how can we reduce the workload on ourselves? How can we bring these systems into a level of complementarity? Now, that doesn't mean unanimous equivalence, right? Some programs have a similar standard to what is dictated at the EBVS level, and some don't. So no one wants to jeopardize the quality that EBVS stands for and continues our commitment to. What we do want to do is reduce the barriers for the consumer to understand which qualification is which, and especially the barriers on how can we work together. Because at the end of the day, whether it is a primary care veterinarian, a national specialist, or an EBVS level specialist, at the end of the day, we work across a spectrum of care. And to a large extent, we actually depend upon one another.
Again, this has been eye-opening for me, talking to different people across Europe with different national specialty qualifications. And for example, yesterday I was speaking to a group of European and French national specialists in Lyon. And the standard to which everyone is working there was just fantastic and amazing. And I could not tell you in that room who was an EBVS specialist, who was a national specialist, and actually who was just really experienced. There were people there who've been working in specialist level practice for 30 years, and they've not board certified, but they're invited to the meetings. They're brought along as part of the community, and it was clear to me that it was a very strong community, working to the same goals, all doing things for the same reasons. And it's inspirational, really, to see that. I think it can cause some confusion to have these different levels of qualification and accreditation. And in the UK, we have the European specialty, we have the American specialty, we have the old RCVS diplomats, we have the certificates, the advanced practitioner level. And then amongst the certificates, we have many different courses that have accredited or allowed people to accredit for advanced practitioner level. So actually, I find it confusing enough to know what makes somebody an advanced practitioner or what route they got there by. Less confusing at specialist level, but we have this kind of first tier referral level in the UK, and certainly over the last few years, as the cost of veterinary care has gone up and the cost of living has also gone up, there are more pet owners who are instinctively following a path towards that first tier referral rather than going to see a specialist in the first instance. And I think there can be quality control issues there. Not always, of course. There are some people there who are fantastically experienced and excellent cardiologists. But actually, the way I think that we can try to navigate that as a profession is collaboration. I think it's got to be that we work together. We provide support where support is needed. And I don't think we can go into that with a competitive mindset. We can't be worried about caseload. We have to try to morph into something that fits the needs of those pets and those owners in the landscape of the profession. But that's stressful, I think.
I really like what you said. I'm going to push it one step further because that's what I do. I deliberately, at the beginning of our conversation, I deliberately declined to comment on recognized as a word. And we did, let's see, at end of year last year, we did a survey with primarily internal stakeholders who had interfaced with the current EBVS leadership within the previous 18 months. We had a really high response rate. And a lot of people said that the most important thing was gaining international recognition as an EBVS specialist. And that is something that still has not been accomplished. And that's a fair observation. We are not written into law at a European level. We are acknowledged in the ESCO occupational profiles as the only recognized European level specialist. But that's the extent of the recognition. But the reason I bring this up is what concerns me, and I think throughout our conversation, this remains underlyingly evident, is having recognition does not solve the problems you just pointed out. What solves the problems are being able to clearly communicate and demonstrate the value we're providing to the client based on the patient's unmet need. And the idea, I think it's a subconscious, not a default, but I think it's a subconscious approach. The idea that international recognition is going to solidify or cement or guarantee our value to the public is unlikely.
I don't think most pet owners know what a specialist is, nor do they care if they're recognized internationally.
They don't care if they're recognized internationally. They care if they were communicated with clearly, transparently, if their animal got good care as far as they can perceive.
Right.
So what I like to do is I like to look at professions where this is done well, where that value is communicated more obviously or more concisely than we're doing. And one of those places, it's tempting to look within medicine. That generally leads us to dentistry or potentially physiotherapy, sometimes pharmacists. But another business model, which is quite interesting, I think, for us, where communication of value and economic value for money spent is commercial airlines. Because
that's not where I was expecting you to go.
Well, if you think about it, pilots are pretty highly trained. They might even be specialized. They're pretty highly regulated. And the average flyer doesn't spend a lot of time seeing the pilot. They might hear the pilot once during the course of the flight come on and say something that sounds like it's every single flight says. But they don't have a lot of interaction there, But the level of trust and the perceived value per euro spent is consistent enough to guarantee the market. So I would suggest that we start challenging ourselves with some of these markets. And, commercial air travel has faced significant hurdles based on COVID in recent years. So there are interesting models where I think we stand to learn some things about conveying what we're providing as a specialist, making sure that the client does appreciate the value, that they are receiving the value for what we're charging.
It's hard to build that trust, isn't it? And that awareness. I mean, it doesn't start on LinkedIn. That's for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a simple surgeon. So for me, I did that the same way that I like to network, which is one-on-one. I think it has to be organic. And I think there's a lot to be said for both bedside manner, but also I think as specialists, myself included, I am right there at the front of the line for this one. It is so easy to put our comfort in competence without necessarily cultivating the confidence that needs to go hand in hand with that, which is part of the perceived value by the client.
And how can we support that in the next generation of veterinary specialists? Do people have access to non-clinical skills training? Do people have, this is more than a course, isn't it? It's more than a webinar. How can we empower people like that?
Oh, my favorite suggestion is very much lead by example. That's not easy. And that's, brings us back to very individual, every individual contributing, right? Certainly, you talk about webinars and courses. Those are pieces of the puzzle that actually EBVS and many other resources are either in the process of building or already offer modular content. Mm-hmm. So I think that is becoming more and more available. I think we can only advocate more and more for its importance. The other piece of the puzzle, again, pioneering here, that I want to call out is, we haven't always been very positive about, we like to call them, in previous years, we like to call them soft skills. You could call them non-clinical skills. I would argue that in a lot of respects, they're very clinical skills. Being able to effectively communicate with a client during a super stressful time or decision-making.
Right. You can measure an atrium super accurately, but who cares if you can't talk to an owner, right?
Exactly. If you can't communicate it in a concise and understandable way, then it doesn't matter how competent you are. So I think that, and as a surgeon or a previous surgeon, we don't necessarily gravitate toward social sciences or what we would consider to be kind of potentially warm and fuzzy topics. But the reality is we haven't always created the healthiest mental habits as a profession, particularly as specialists. And if we want to be committed, to the success of residents, it is worth our while to focus on not only what would inspire healthier habits for their long-term success, but what would inspire healthier mental habits, for example, to prevent my burnout, to prevent attrition of the diplomats that we've trained over the last 5 or 10 years. What about retention of our staff? I think there are a lot of pieces where investing not just in soft skills for residents, but for all of us is highly warranted.
Great stuff.
As our season is about icons, legends, it would be really interesting maybe to try to make a link here. And something we thought to have your opinion on is, as we're talking now about communication skills, soft skills, so it would be to have your input on what makes a great specialist or someone that could become a leader or an icon or a legend. What do you think are the combination of factors, skills, mindsets that would make someone a great specialist? As you step back, is there a pattern here of someone that can be a great specialist? Do you think we could?
What do the icons of pig medicine and
exactly.
fish pathology have
in common?
In common with the icons of cardiology? Because I bet there are things.
There probably are things, but from specialty to specialty, the requirements can be surprisingly diverse. I think that's one thing I've learned trying to execute the complicated logistics of our video project. But I'm going to go back a step and talk about my idea of a legend, because I think it's not limited to a specialist. I think it's accessible for any veterinarian who's interested in leadership or really, really highly desiring impact and legacy, right? So I like to come back to, I believe they're Brene Brown's words. I think that the idea of leader, heal thyself is paramount. I think that is inherent for pretty much every legend I can think of. I also think investing in our own confidence is required, not only to be a great specialist, but also to be a legend. And then I would say resilience, being persistent, being willing to try again, keep going, be creative, step out of the box, step out of the comfort zone. I think you can only grow from this. And, you were talking, Jose, about having intended to go back to your home country, and life happens, right? Like, we don't always have control over that, but sometimes that is the beauty, and that is where you sometimes find your opportunity for legacy. So I think embrace the uncertainty, be willing to play with the uncertainty, find out what's available to you.
That's a great message to finish on, I think.
Absolutely.
There are going to be lots of people listening to this who begin and probably think, I'm not a specialist. I'm not going to be a specialist. But I really hope there are things in here that people can reflect on or take away and think, actually, I think maybe I could think about that in how I'm working at whatever level, in whatever country people are working in.
Yeah, I think one of the things I didn't say, and I usually harp on this, is we've got to be at eye level. We've got to be at eye level. And it's easy, I think, to default. We're trained to default to passive language. That's what scientific publications depend on, right? And it's easy to default into, I remember I think it was jejunal cecostomy. The prognosis range, the published prognosis range was like 30 to 70%. Well, that's meaningless for an owner. That's meaningless. Like, that's worse than flipping a coin. It's such a broad range. It doesn't mean anything. And so no one can understand when we default to that kind of language, whether it's a client, a horse owner, whether it's a referring veterinarian, like, they know you're just giving them jargon. So, and it's not the specialist's fault. That's the published value. But I just think when we look at the person and we speak at eye level, it doesn't matter who they are, it's just so much more impactful.
Julie, can I just ask you, as an EBVS CEO, what would be your biggest dream? If once you look back, you step down from being a CEO of EBVS and you go in the next project, what would you like your legacy to be?
Do you want me to choose just one?
Yeah, maybe just I don't know. Yeah, maybe just one.
I love the ambition.
I would like for us to own where we are in the profession. I think that if we have knowledge about our market and what its potential could be, the status quo and where we want to go, I think that's empowerment. And I think, having the skills to appropriately communicate our value and the value of what we do, that's empowerment at every level, at government level, at competitive business level, at personal fulfillment level. That's empowerment, in my humble opinion.
Brilliant.
Amazing.
This was great. Yeah, this was great. Thank you, Julie. It was really,
thanks very
really
much.
nice.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for letting me ramble on about all of my unexpected tangents.
This is a safe space for tangential conversation.
Goodness.
Right, Julie, thanks so much.
Thanks, both of you. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Really, really, really value your time, and a lot of stuff to go and think about, I think.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and it was lovely to meet and chat with both of you, and I look forward to meeting you again sometime soon.
You have been listening to the Animal Heartbeat. Thanks very much for our listeners.
Keep in touch by finding us on social media or sending us an email on animalheartbeat@gmail.com. Please remember to like, follow, and share to help us find new listeners. And make sure to check out our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts from or on our YouTube channel.